Have you ever heard about the heroic exploits of the Titanic musicians and engineers? Did you know that on that fateful night there was a ship just 10 kilometers away from Titanic that could have saved everyone? The history of the legendary ship is horrifying. So some of the facts about Titanic and that ill-fated night make us feel bad, but they're worth knowing because they may reveal many secrets. In this episode, I'll tell you some creepy and interesting facts about Titanic which will make your blood run cold. Let's go. Titanic was astonishing, not only for its size but also for its interior. The ship had a whole bunch of different rooms, a reading room, a smoking room, gyms, and more. All these rooms were available to the first-class passengers who were served by dozens of crew members and for whom musicians played. There were a total of 8 musicians aboard the ship. They are what many people remember when it comes to the sinking of the ship, because the musicians stood on deck and played while frightened people were running around. A lucky survivor, a second-class passenger, said many brave things had been done that fateful night, but they paled in comparison to the musicians' heroic exploit. The musicians were aware that they did not have much time left to live. They knew that in a few minutes people would be in the icy water, realized the horror and inevitability of the situation, but did not show fear and played to the very end to calm and cheer up the passengers. Unfortunately, none of the 8 musicians survived that fateful night, but their heroic deed will always be remembered. Engineers. No less heroic feat was performed by the Titanic's engineers, but if the musicians cheered up the passengers and tried to cut the tension, the engineers kept the ship powered up until the very end. That is, literally until the very end. The lights went out only a few minutes before the ship went down. This scene is even in James Cameron's movie. It comes right before the scene where Titanic splits in two. Titanic was carrying about 900 crew members. After the tragedy, less than a third of the workers survived. Unfortunately, not a single engineer was among them. They simply had no time to save themselves. They kept the electricity on board so the radio operators could transmit distress signals and the passengers could be rescued in good visibility. They also kept the ship's pumps running, prolonging the sinking of Titanic as much as possible. All 35 engineers went down with Titanic. None of them survived. To commemorate the heroic feat, a memorial was erected in the British town of Southampton dedicated to the Titanic's engineers. A bronze figure of the winged goddess Nike stands on the bow of the ship, holding wreaths with her arms outstretched wide. She towers over 2 bas-reliefs connected by a semicircular pediment depicting the Titanic's mechanics at work. Do you know what exactly happened when the ship hit the iceberg? Many people think that the iceberg punched a hole in Titanic, which caused the ship to fill up with water and sink. In fact, it didn't punch a hole. It sort of ripped through the hull, and it might have been caused by a fire. Many experts believe that the fire in the coal hold started before the ship left port and continued for several days. At first, this version was considered absurd, but it's confirmed by the fact that the photos of the ship in the port show large traces of soot in the ship's hull, indicating a recent fire. Moreover, the version also ages with the words of Titanic stoker John Dilley, who said that a serious fire raged for 5 days in boiler room number 6. It's believed that the incident was covered up so as to not tarnish the credibility of the White Star Line Company. The fire made the ship's outer hull brittle, so after Titanic collided with an iceberg, exactly where the fire had earlier occurred, the hull could not withstand the pressure and was ripped open. The rivet snapped, water seeped through the metal sheets, and began to fill the ship. Many experts believe that it was the fire that destroyed the ship, because if it had not happened, the hull would have survived the collision with the iceberg. Could the passengers have been saved that awful night? Some people think so, because all the Titanic crew members had to do was load more lifeboats onto the ship. However, others believe that Titanic's death was predetermined and predicted by a couple of writers before the disaster. Stay tuned to find out the frightening details of these predictions and understand how the passengers and crew members could have been saved. Let's move on. One of the main reasons that makes the wreck of Titanic so horrible is the number of victims. On the fateful April night, from 1,500 to 1,600 people have become the victims of the wreck. No one can give an exact figure. This is about 2/3 of the people on board, because at the time of the collision with the iceberg, there were 2,224 people on Titanic. It's believed that the enormous number of victims is a direct consequence of the insufficient number of lifeboats. There could have been 60 lifeboats on board, in which all the passengers would have survived. but in fact there were only 20. In addition, it took a very long time to prepare the lifeboats for launching. It's estimated that the officers spent 60 of the 160 minutes during which the ship was sinking. Finally, the lifeboats were not completely filled. This moment is even shown in James Cameron's legendary movie. Many people believe that if there were more lifeboats, if they were unloaded faster, and if they were crammed full to capacity, the number of survivors could have been close to 2,000, and it's hard to argue with that. But salvation could not only be sought in the lifeboats. People from Titanic could have been saved by the ships that were in relative proximity to Titanic that night. Probably everyone knows that in the end the survivors were picked up by the steamship Carpathia. It was this ship that rushed at full speed to the site of the tragedy, but did not arrive there until 4 in the morning, about an hour and a half after Titanic had completely sunk. Nevertheless, things could have been very different. Soon after the disaster, it became clear that Carpathia was not the closest ship to the sinking Titanic. Much closer to the ship was the SS Californian. It was about 10 kilometers away from Titanic. Imagine how close that is. For comparison, Carpathia was 93 kilometers from Titanic. The crew of the SS Californian saw all the flares from Titanic and even tried to convince the ship's captain to go to the site where the flares were fired from. However, the captain didn't pay any attention to it. The crew of the SS Californian never made contact with the sinking Titanic and did not help it in any way. Subsequently, the captain of the SS Californian, Stanley Lord, was accused of inaction and soon resigned. Many experts agree that if the captain had made the right decision and steered the ship to Titanic, the SS Californian would have been able to save a huge number of people because it was very close. Probably it would have managed to reach the place even before Titanic completely sunk. The wreck of Titanic was predicted. Titanic was called an unsinkable ship even before its maiden voyage. And indeed, it was very coolly designed. For the period of the early 20th century, Titanic was a revolutionary ship, which could stay afloat even if several compartments were seriously damaged. But what if none of this mattered, and the ship was inherently doomed to the wreck? Many people believe that the ship's wreck was predicted long before it sailed for America. In 1898, a book was published in England by writer Morgan Robertson called Futility, which was republished in 1912 as The Wreck of the Titan, or Futility. It was in 1912, the year of the Titanic's wreck, that the book became popular, and it's not surprisingly. In this book, Robertson describes in extreme detail the sinking of a huge passenger steamer suspiciously similar to Titanic. The amount of details in the book that eventually coincided with reality is staggering and wildly frightening. In Robertson's book, the ship is called the Titan. Like Titanic, it sailed from England to America. Like Titanic, it crashed on an April night in 1912 in the Atlantic Ocean. Like Titanic, it collided with an iceberg on its starboard. In addition, the main reason for the large number of victims in Robertson's book is the same as in reality, a lack of lifeboats due to the ship owner's confidence. Even the size of the Titan and the real Titanic are very similar. Hard to believe it's all just a series of coincidences. Maybe Robertson saw the future, knew how it would end, and tried to warn the world with his book. With each new detail about Titanic and the people who were associated with it, one begins to believe that many people are capable of seeing into the future. William Thomas Stead is another such visionary. He was a British journalist, publicist, and public figure. He was known as a probable contender for the 1912 Nobel Peace Prize and as one of the pioneers of investigative journalism. But to many people, he's known as the man who may have predicted the wreck of Titanic along with Robertson. A few years before the tragedy, William, who often said he would not die his own death, released 2 stories. In the first, titled How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor, he described the collision of 2 steamers and the lack of lifeboats. In the second story, titled From the Old World to the New, William described the ship's encounter with an iceberg. Yes, there are not as many coincidences as in Robertson's book, but still, the voyage to America, the iceberg, the wreck in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the scenario of the wreck is exactly the same as that of Titanic. Maybe the journalist knew something about it. By the way, William Thomas Stead was on Titanic that fateful night. Unfortunately, he didn't survive the catastrophe. That's all, guys. What frightening fact about Titanic impressed you the most? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching and see you later.